ecclesiastical splendor of the Renaissance completely enthralls the imagination. The dome of St. Peter's rises upwards like a heavenly choir. From the topmost pinnacle, the centuries that are Rome spread out in everlasting significance.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a discussion over artificial intelligence. So we have Boaz from the orthodoxsnake.com, Colin Causey, and Roses and Guns. An interesting cast, I must say. Really smart guys. I'm not the smartest guy here. I'll be on the bottom of that, of the four. But so
you've written the most, though.
Quantity over quality, I guess, but I'll take that. So we'll just jump right into it. So computation, what does that mean?
Yeah, so put basically, computation is what a computer does. Okay, well, what's a computer? So you can think of a computer as a machine that processes representations systematically according to rules. Mathematically speaking, this is typically defined in terms of effective methods. So the idea is, in the early 20th century, there's a big question about, can you automate mathematics? Can you come up with an algorithm that, given any mathematical statement as input, it can output whether it's true or false? And prior to the 20th century, it would have been impossible to answer that because there was no mathematically precise definition of an algorithm. It was just informally defined as, it's a step-by-step procedure that allows you to solve a problem. Due to the work of people like Alan Turing and Alonzo Church, Kurt Gödel, and Stephen Kleene and others, we got to a more mathematically precise definition of what an algorithm is and what a computation is. So back in the day, a computer was actually a human being who would just calculate a bunch of things. So you would have laboratories that would employ human computers, and they would just be responsible for carrying out a bunch of calculations. And so Alan Turing, in developing his mathematical model of a computer, now called a Turing machine, wanted to come up with a model that would mimic what a human computer does when he or she carries out a computation. And so basically, a Turing machine is supposed to model what a human being can do in principle with paper and pencil. Now, I say in principle because, of course, something might be too laborious to carry out in a lifetime for a single human being. But that's not super important for the model. So a effective method can be defined as follows. So the method is set out in terms of a finite number of exact instructions, and each of those instructions is expressed by means of a finite number of symbols. The method will, if carried out without error, produce the desired result in a finite number of steps. The method can, in practice or in principle, be carried out by a human being, unaided by any machinery except paper and pencil. And then the machine demands no insight, intuition, or ingenuity in the part of the human being carrying out the method. So you're strictly just doing paper and pencil calculations. You're not looking at something and kind of going, it seems like this is probably the right answer. You're not relying on any kind of intuition. It's purely mechanical. And so the Turing machine is kind of a mathematical idealization of an effective method. And so a major result that was put forward was the Church-Turing thesis. It's not been proven, but essentially it's a thesis about effective methods. So it's a thesis that says effective methods, what you can do with effective methods are exactly what you can do with Turing machines. And so that means if there's something you can't do with a Turing machine, then you also can't do it with effective methods. In other words, a human being wouldn't be able to paper and pencil. So the idea of a computation, carrying out an algorithm, became equivalent to a Turing machine. So if you could come up with a Turing machine for something, then you can solve. If you can't know that there is no Turing machine algorithm for a problem, you then show that that problem cannot be computed. And as it happened, it was shown number theory, for instance, is not decidable. It's not true that given any arithmetic statement that a Turing machine can produce true or false in a finite number of steps. So that was a major result that up a partition in the philosophy of math called logic, is the idea that mathematics can be reduced to purely logical formulas, and logical turn can be decided by an algorithm. And both of those propositions were undermined. But the idea that it can be automated was particularly undermined by the results that came out of this idea of Turing machines. So simply put, a computation is a calculation carried out in accordance with an effective method. It's what a human being could do with paper and pencil, in principle.
Right. So you have a number of steps, finite steps. You have some rules. Now, tell me, does the definition include what kind of rules, like how complex the rules have to be themselves? So when you say pen and paper done by a human, are we talking just arithmetic, algebraic, mathematical stuff, or are we talking any kind of instruction?
Yeah. So it's any kind of instruction that can be represented logically. So, I mean, essentially, might have a Turing machine has, so I should say as well, so the idea of a Turing machine, it's a mathematical model, but it's conceived of as this simple little mechanical device with an infinitely long tape and a read-write head that's over a particular, so that infinitely long, and it's divided up into equal-sized cells. And then there's a read-write head that at any given time is over exactly one cell. And at any given step of a computation, the read-write head can write a symbol to the tape, it can read a symbol from the tape, and then it can move right one or left one, and then it kind of proceeds from there. So if you think of, and the symbols that it's able to print to the tape is called the alphabet of the machine. So you might have a binary alphabet where you just have zeros and ones. In that case, you could come up with a Turing machine program that simulates some sort of cooking procedure. You add ingredients to a pot, you cook it for a certain amount of time. But in order to do that, you have to represent what you're talking about with binary encodings. So you might say, okay, well, let's represent bread with a 0. Let's represent cheese with a 0, 1. Let's represent broccoli with a 1, 0, and so forth. As long as you have a unique name for all these objects that you want to compute over, you can do that. And so Turing's insight was, okay, I want to come up with an extremely simple machine that can only perform a few very basic operations, but I want to be able to show that that's all you need to actually carry out anything a human being can do with paper and pencil. It might take a lot more time. It might take a lot more steps because you have to break it down into tiny, tiny little basic steps. But in principle, you can do that. But simply put, I mean, a Turing machine it reads a symbol, writes a symbol, moves left one, moves right one. And then in certain conditions, it can stop operating and halt. And hopefully what's on the tape when it halts is the answer that you want. Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that this design of a computer is also influenced by mathematician John von Neumann. In fact, this type of computer is called a von Neumann design. The separate permanent memory and then the processing, which is separate, it also presents a certain interesting issue with respect to the upper limits of processing speed as the bottleneck that's created between the read function and the long-term storage memory presents certain physical difficulties.
Yeah. There is research now into alternative architectures than the von Neumann one. But another really influential idea with the von Neumann architecture, input data and programs, the actual instructions, are kind of conceived of as really just one thing. It's all data. The inputs to the programs and then the programs themselves are just all data. You can think of it as all just one kind of thing. And that lets you actually use programs as input to other programs and compete with those and do interesting things.
I've heard it classified as neuromorphic architecture. I don't know if you've come across that.
Yeah, so neuromorphic computing is the attempt to build a computer that is sort of based on the brain. So there are neural networks that you can implement in software where you kind of have the simulation of neurons and firing patterns and so forth. Neuromorphic computing is taking that and putting it into hardware where you actually have like, silicon neurons and so forth. And you actually try to have a simulation of what our brain does in actual hardware instead of just merely simulating it in the software. And the hope there is that, well, if we can mimic what the brain does physically, then we'll be able to produce consciousness possibly. Or at the very least, it'll help us to better understand neuroscience, and we can run simulations on this machine and test them against brain studies and so forth.
There's an interesting thought experiment regarding that. I don't think that Searle originated it, but I read it in some of his work. So he imagines the creation of a single. It's a combination AI ship of Theseus problem. I love it. So imagine that we can artificially create not a brain, right, which is extraordinarily complex, but a single synapse. Right? We are able to create a single functioning brain synapse, and someone suffers a very, very minor injury, and their brain is replaced with a single synapse, right? And it still works, and they're still the person, and they're conscious. And I'm sure you all can see where this is going. Just imagine that you continue to replace their brain with these artificial synapses. At what point would they cease to be a person, or would that be an example of an emergent AI consciousness, or where's the dividing line in that sort of an example? But that raises all sorts of interesting questions. I don't know if you wanted to get into those.
Yeah.
So they can never develop free will, though.
But it's a person, right, Michael? It starts out as a person already with free will. At what point does it cease, right? I think we would all agree that the entire brain with one artificial synapse, well, maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you would simply at that point say that it's not a person. I don't know. I don't know where your dividing line is. But assuming such a thing was even possible, I would not think that a single person with just one artificial synapse would be an artificial person.
Yeah. So, so this argument wasn't given by Searle, although it did inspire Searle. This is an argument given by Ned Block, and he kind of develops what he calls the Chinese nation argument. So I should say, undergirding this idea of this gradual replacement of a brain by artificial components is the thesis called functionalism. So functionalism is probably the dominant materialist view of the mind in the philosophy of mind today. The basic idea is that what matters for the mind is not the stuff that it's made out of, but the causal processes that constitute it. It's the functional organization of something that really makes it what it is, instead of the materials out of which it's made. So to use an example,
that's worth pointing out that that's still a material reductionist view.
Well, it's not reductive in the sense that it is a reduction of sorts, but it's not like full-blown reductive materialism, where we're saying that the mind is just that mental states are identical to certain physical states.
Right,
Functionalism,
because
Well, yeah,
well, let me
that's
jump in here.
mhm.
Because it seems like the functionalist point is if it can operate on instructions, on effective instructions, it has a mind. It has a mind of its own, as we might say. Um, and that could go a reductive way and say nothing really has a positively spiritual mind uh, like the traditional world religions want to say. Or you go the direction of everything actually has a mind, because uh, everything, even atoms, you could say, follow rules and certain instructions. So if having a mind is just following some rule or instruction, well, everything does that. So that's its own can of worms, metaphysically.
Mhm.
yeah, I should say as well, the basic functionalist thesis is actually compatible with dualism. You could be a dualist functionalist because you could say that the right causal processes for the mind are instantiated in an immaterial substance. Now, as it happens, most functionalists are materialists. Usually, they'll try to invoke Occam's razor and say, well, but if you can have the same causal processes in a physical substance, then why bother
Yeah,
positing
why
an
bother?
immaterial substance? Um, but to use an example of this idea of defining the mind in terms of function, think of a knife. Right, a knife isn't really defined in terms of the stuff that it's made out of. It's defined in terms of its ability to perform the function of cutting. And as
Mhm.
long as you have something that can perform that function, it's a knife. Now, it's not a trivial thesis, though, because while you can make a knife out of steel or plastic, you can't make one out of shaving cream because it just won't do the job of cutting. You can't cut with a shaving cream knife. So there are non-trivial constraints as far as what could actually constitute a knife. And so the idea here is that um, it's the same thing. There might be some things that uh, a mind could not be instantiated in because it just can't instantiate the right functions there.
It doesn't have the proper form.
Yeah. Um, but it does, in principle, allow the mind to be instantiated in a number of different kinds of things. It could be the gray matter of the brain. It could be electronic circuits. Could be some sort of alien material, some sort of alien brain that we haven't seen before. Um, and so this idea of being able to instantiate the mind in multiple different kinds of media is called the multiple realizability thesis of functionalism. That part of functionalism was a response to the brain identity thesis, where it's like, well, the mind is identical to the brain. And that seemed unsatisfactory because it seems like, well, I mean, really, like you couldn't possibly have a mind without the brain. It seems like, well, surely in some possible world, at least, there's something that's a mind but not a brain. And so functionalism was like, well, yeah, you can have a mind in things that aren't brains as long as you have the right functional organization there. Um, and then the way this gets relevant to AI, it's a very natural supplementation of functionalism to pair it with this idea that, well, the right causal organization, the right functional organization is patterned on the execution of an algorithm, right? And so you start to look at computers and it's like, well, computers seem to do all these things that ordinarily would require thinking. Um, and the other thing is the executions of their programs are completely causal. State A causes state B, which causes state C, and so forth. And so you have seemingly intelligent processes going on that are entirely causally integrated with the physical world. And that's attractive because, for instance, with Cartesian dualism, you have the classic interaction problem where, well, how does this immaterial mind get into causal contact with the physical world? Well, with computers, it's like, well, we seem to have intelligent processes, and it just is a causal system. So that seems very attractive. There's no mystery there's no causal mystery with how a computer works. And so sometimes this idea of, well, maybe the mind is a computational system is blended with functionalism, and the result is sometimes called Turing machine functionalism, where the mind is defined in terms of its abstract structure, and that abstract structure is a Turing machine, and that Turing machine is implemented on some piece of hardware that's complex enough to be able to properly instantiate the Turing machine. And so as long as you have some sort of physical system that can implement the right sorts of causal relationships to implement that Turing machine, then if you have a Turing machine sophisticated enough to be to do what our minds do, then you would have an artificial mind. You could create a conscious machine in principle.
Mm-hmm.
I find something really unappealing about that view, though. I mean, as you just said, the proponents would say it takes the mystery out of it to just say it functions like a mind. It does the thing. We're going to call it a mind. I find something really unappealing about that, and I feel like there's the mystery is, to use Ed Fazer's term, it's like this giant ball of dust that's swept under the rug, and they just say, okay, yeah, the room's clean. Because by saying that, we haven't really analyzed natural minds. We haven't really plumbed the depths of human rationality. We've just taken a few examples. Okay, a human can do this, and a computer can do that. They seem similar enough. That's just what the nature of a mind is, and we're going to stop it at that. I guess my first objection to that is, well, okay, hang on. I thought we were supposed to be scientists. We really haven't gotten to the depths of a mind by saying that, by just offloading the explanation to a function. I mean,
Yeah,
yes,
the purpose
that's
of what
important.
we're doing here is to explain things, not explain them away.
Right.
Mm.
That's a pretty good objection. I like that. That's well stated.
Yeah, and I enjoy seeing the debate back and forth. I think we can get to the real truth that way, the heart of the truth. So yeah, Roses and Guns, did you have an objection to that as well, or?
I don't necessarily have any objections. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that we're talking about purely theoretical AI, and that the current state is, doesn't resemble this in any way. I suppose great strides have been made in my own preparation for this. I, ran across some of the more interesting advances that have been recently made, particularly with Chat GPT or whatever the name, the trade name is, which didn't particularly interest me, but I thought those were the sort of topics that most people would be familiar with.
Yeah, we can transition into that.
No, I'm not trying to transition to that. I actually find this topic insanely boring, but out of respect for you all, I decided to participate and offer what few insights I might have.
Well, okay, but have you tried Wombo AI though?
No, I haven't. Tell me about it. Let's hear it.
That's the one where generates art from like a whatever prompt you want. It usually comes out either looking like a fever dream or has a dog in it. These AI, they love dogs. I think they were trained on pictures of dogs.
That was one of the first kind of breakthrough applications of machine learning, was like identifying dogs in pictures and cats in pictures.
Okay, so I did a little bit of reading on that. That's the type of machine learning. It's called deep learning. Is that where that come from?
Deep learning is a particular subset of machine learning.
But this ability, for instance, to identify a dog. So in a deep learning algorithm, there's, I don't know, I think of it, this is sort of materialist, but I sort of think of it as like there's an initial scan, and it identifies very basic attributes that are vaguely associated with different animals, right? And then it does a second scan that then begins to bring greater definition, not necessarily in absolute terms, but just other attributes. And it continues doing this process until it's able to say, oh, okay, it can distinguish between the different forms and say this is a dog as opposed to a cow or a wolf or an elephant, and it slowly goes through this process, and each tier is in some way dependent upon the prior one.
Right. And
this is
Casey,
deep learning, is that right?
You're the comp sci, so correct me if I'm wrong. In between all those steps, you have a human or a whole team or community of humans giving feedback to the computer saying, okay, you were right about this one. This is a dog.
Supervised learning.
This is actually a car, so on. Like, it's highly curated between every iteration, correct?
It depends on the method used. So what you're describing is supervised learning, where one way to do it would be to say, okay, here's a bunch of pictures that I'm telling you have dogs in them, and then here's a bunch that I'm telling you do not have dogs in them. And then it kind of goes through and it does this analysis, as Roses and Guns was talking about, where it kind of, okay, we're kind of getting commonalities. Okay, this is a dog, this is a dog. And you kind of go through a number of iterations. And then in the future, so this idea of kind of labeling and these are dogs, these are non-dogs, is training the model. And then once that's kind of in place, then you start giving it new data. So now it's going to start being predictive. So now it sees a picture it's never seen before. And based on its training set, it's going to say, okay, probably, yeah, I think that's a dog. And it's going to label it dog. And then a human can go, no, that doesn't have a dog. And then it will update its model accordingly. And it just kind of goes on from there. And the quality of the output, I mean, as a common saying goes in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. So the quality of the output is going to be determined by the quality of the training data that it has. The training data is really bad. It's not going to be very good at predicting future things that it hasn't seen before. But there's also like unsupervised learning. And usually the idea there is you have this data set and you don't, as a human, you're not even sure what you're looking for in the data set. You're just like, okay, are there patterns here? And it will just kind of go through and see if it can find some sort of patterns. And then once you get a pattern, you can kind of think about it as a human, like, okay, well, I think that's what's going on here. And then
I've seen that described as deep belief network. And the example is from encephalography. So you have these impulses of electricity that are detectable on the body, and they started detecting these back in the 1920s, but they had no idea how to even analyze these. But we use computational analysis to determine the patterns, and then we can predict if someone is going to have a stroke with a high degree of probability, these sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, that's a massive data that an ordinary human could not even begin to analyze, but a machine is able to compute it and then give probability of certain outcomes.
Yeah.
Right, and I find both of those models, the supervised and the unsupervised, really fascinating, because what it sounds like from a scholastic angle is what we're doing is we're basically offloading the recognition of species and genus onto these computers. We're telling them, this is the species we're looking for. This is the species we're not looking for. Here are some differences we want you to use as a rule. And we found a way to convert those into directions that a computer can accept. And in the supervised learning, it sounds like we're saying at the beginning of the process, okay, hey, here are the parameters, have fun. But even in the unsupervised ones where we don't know what we're looking at, fMRI, for example, we want to see a pattern. It sounds like we've given a program a couple of examples of, hey, here's a bell curve or something, some pattern that we recognize. Can you see anything like it? Can you recognize a similar species in all this data? So it's really fascinating because in Aquinas, a big thing for him about the the sign of rationality is, can something recognize a new species and genus? So basically, can it recognize a new form? Can it introduce new differences, new commonalities, and things like that? It sounds like the clever thing that's happening with these deep learning AIs, we're basically offloading that to them by turning them into rules that they can understand, and then say, okay, have fun. And then we go back and we reflect on them. They're like augmenting our ability to see differences and specifics and things like that. So I think it's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So yeah, how do those two models, supervised learning and unsupervised learning, how do they compare to reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so reinforcement learning is sort of carrot and stick training, where you use some sort of reward model, and the machine is trying to maximize its reward and minimize its punishment. It's like really simply, you can just think of like, okay, it wants to get the highest score possible. You just think of the score as an integer. Things are more complicated than this, but you can just think of, okay, I want to get the highest score I can. And then essentially what happens is it says, okay, I make this prediction. And then the human says, no, that's wrong. And then the human punishes it by taking points off of its score. And it says, oh, well, I don't want to go through that again, so I better do something different. And then it'll come up and say, okay, here's my new prediction. Oh, yeah, that's right. And so here's some points for you. And so it kind of, the model gets updated by the program trying to maximize its reward and minimize its punishment.
I've actually heard reinforcement learning explained differently, so maybe we can maybe you can clear that up for me. I've actually heard it as a balance of of exploration and exploitation. So you imagine that you are like a group of like a small tribe, and you're in an area with a certain amount of resources, and there's a debate about whether to stay in that area and continue to draw from what are limited resources, or to spend your time and energy looking for new resources. Right? There's a trade-off, and I was hoping you would give the fun example, because that, you know, this is one of the great things about philosophy, is that we have the best examples. It's the one-armed bandit approach, right? So the gambler is in a casino, and there's the constant internal debate about whether to continue playing the same slot machine, which may or may not be paying off, or to go to a different slot machine, examine what rewards could possibly be there. But I don't know. That's how I've heard it described. I don't know if maybe I got that wrong.
So I think I caught most of that. I had a brief connection thing, but
I'm sorry.
That's an approach you can take as well. So,
Yeah, I would say they're about the same. I see the same
issues.
the focus is the same of both of those examples.
Right. I mean, that sounds like reinforcement plus foresight. So you're not only taking into account like the score of a video game, say whatever. You're not just taking account of the present score, but you're also thinking ahead enough to say, okay, I could probably get a better score if I eventually do this, and also start planning for it now. I could definitely see that occurring in animal studies, but when it comes to computers, it seems like that's a whole nother process we'd have to program out. Like, is pre-planning possible? It is probably a much more complicated process trying to program that in.
Yeah. So that just kind of ties back into like a rational soul. It's composed of reason, will, and memory. So like AI, it wouldn't have the will, so it wouldn't have the foresight, I guess. Yeah,
But presumably it could be programmed with self-preservation, right? I mean, I don't know why that wouldn't. I mean, any objection of that nature, I don't know why it couldn't be overcome with programming. Am I wrong?
So yeah, I learned
Well, yeah, I mean,
in college, but I didn't go further than that. So I'm the wrong guy to ask that. But
I mean, I don't know. We'll see.
yeah, I mean,
can you guys hear
depends
me?
on what you count as will.
Yeah,
Like,
you're
if
fine.
we're talking will to power, like Nietzsche,
yeah,
Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, and you're fine with just saying, yeah, the whole point of willpower is survival, and that's it. Then yeah, you could probably program something to have. We probably already have, in fact, programmed something with survival as the goal.
Are there? So I hear a lot about self-replicating machines, but I wonder how extensive that is. It's my understanding that these are simply part of a manufacturing process, and that they're simply manufacturing parts of other machines that will be then assembled. It's not actually self-replicating in the sense that, it births a machine that is, of exact specification, or anyway. I hope my point is understood here. Are you aware of anything regarding this?
As far as self-replicating?
Yeah. I mean, this would seem to be something that's necessary for a definition of life. Perhaps not simply
Yeah.
intelligence, and maybe we're getting off of the topic a bit, but I mean, I think that's at least part of the background of the debate here, is if there was ever an artificial brain, an artificial mind that attained consciousness, that was then would then at least receive some of the same benefits, some privileges of other living things.
Have you all ever heard the story of Henrietta Lack? I
Yeah,
think
of course.
Like this, it was the cells that were replicating. So, yeah, I'm not overly familiar with that story. I watched the documentary about it from that politics guy. I don't know if y'all know who I'm talking about.
Right. So Henrietta Lacks was one of the first subjects we realized had an immortal human cell line. What they actually are is their cancer cells. She was a cancer patient. She died, but a whole line of her cells were taken from her without her knowledge or her family's knowledge, and packaged as a biomedical product. And those are still used to this day as a colony of human cell test subjects for medicine, because the line of cells is immortal. They will keep reproducing forever if you give them calories.
Yeah. So that was an Adam Curtis documentary. Have you ever heard of him? That's my favorite documentary maker. But so yeah, how does that tie into AI? Could something similar happen with artificial intelligence? I guess it would need instead of calories, just the human input.
But that wouldn't be fully independent intelligence, right? I mean, if it requires human input, I would think it would need to have some degree of autonomy.
Yeah. So can it outgrow that? Can it?
At least that would be my definition of life.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to speculate about such things.
Right, because even if they could self-replicate, they are still just going off of the rules that you gave them. It's just that the rules are very complex and results in another one of them, which is amazing, but it's a lot different from being able to make new rules or recognize something else in the world that they weren't originally told to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, what is the method that would bring us closest to that current scientists are working on, or programmers, of self-replicating AI, like AI that lives on its own, that does not need human input?
I suppose there's software that's running around in the virtual world that is something akin to that, but it can't sustain itself in that if we just cut the power, it would die. So I don't know. It's not like a human in that if its food source dried up, it would just go somewhere else and try to find additional food, right?
Yeah, although I mean, if you cut our brainstem,
yeah,
we'd
we're
probably-
not gonna do too much, are we?
Yeah, the only self-replication stuff that I'm really familiar with is just in terms of a Turing machine replicating itself. So there's a theorem that allows a Turing machine to create a copy of itself and then go on and compute with that copy of itself. That's in terms of the mathematical model. I mean, that doesn't have necessarily any implications for how you might instantiate that in the physical world. But mathematically, it works out.
Yeah, and so speaking of Turing, what is the Turing test?
Yeah, so
Go ahead and get that one out of the way. That's an easy.
in 1950, Alan Turing came out with probably his most famous paper. Not necessarily his most important, but his most famous, called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And here he thought about the idea of whether a machine could have intelligence. And instead of trying to define what intelligence is, he decided, well, that's a hopeless project. Let's just say that if a machine can fool you into thinking it's intelligent, then it's intelligent. So he had this idea of the Turing test, or as he called it, the imitation game. And you can think of it as a chat program where you're chatting with this other party. And if you cannot tell whether the entity you're communicating with is human or not, then this entity has passed the Turing test. And therefore, you ought to impute intelligence to it.
Which is still functionalism, really, because what we're saying is it functional enough to trick someone, a human being, into thinking it's another human being?
Yeah, functionalists, some functionalists anyway, would dispute that. So, for instance, there are computational functionalists who think that, yeah, a computer can have consciousness and so forth. But they would reject the Turing test as being adequate. They would argue that the Turing test really presupposes behaviorism, where behaviorism is a now defunct position in the philosophy of mind that says that consciousness and thoughts, intentionality, and so forth can all be reduced to behavioral dispositions. In particular, beliefs as well can be reduced to this. So my belief that it's raining outside is actually reducible to my behavioral disposition to grab an umbrella as I walk out the door. That's all there is to having the belief that it's raining outside. Well, you can imagine why nobody holds to this idea anymore today. It just doesn't make any sense. Obviously, my belief that it's raining can't be reduced to my disposition to grab an umbrella. It doesn't make any sense. And so one idea is that, well, the only thing the Turing test is doing is just talking about behavior. As long as the behavior is indistinguishable from the behavior of an actual intelligence, then you ought to attribute intelligence to it because, well, that's all there is to intelligence is behavior. That's all it is. It's this reductionist project. Now, one objection to functionalism, though, is that really at the end of the day, functionalism collapses into behaviorism. That's an objection that's raised that functionalists try to deal with. But the Turing test itself is just all about input-output behavior.
Yeah. Have you ever watched the movie Ex Machina?
No.
Ooh, I'm surprised no one's ever watched that. It's a really popular movie. It had the guy from Star Wars, both of the guys from Star Wars, the newer Star Wars movies.
Oh, the newer ones.
It was about like when was about the Turing test, basically, like when can artificial intelligence trick a human into believing that it's real. So y'all will have to check that out. It's a really cool movie.
I know plays a big part in Blade Runner,
Yeah,
the Turing test.
Yeah,
that's a very
Good one.
major part of the plot. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
classic.
The Voight-Comp test. That's a phenomenal film that I got to enjoy for the first time in philosophy of film. So
Oh, nice.
love it.
Yeah, and they're making a third Blade Runner, aren't they?
They made a second one. I didn't know there was a second one.
It was well received, very well received.
I'll have to watch it.
I'm just waiting for the Mario movie.
Ooh, Mario.
Yeah, I have to say it looks better than the one with the live action one that came out in the late 80s or early 90s.
Oh yeah, that was like one of the worst movies ever.
It was a train wreck.
I thought it was okay.
But, we're gonna have to have a movie discussion night.
Yeah,
it was that is good.
So yes,
but
so I guess the next place we can. I'll go finish your thought, Colin. Finish your.
Oh,
thought.
I was just gonna say maybe we should start talking about objections to this idea that a computer can be conscious and the Turing test and all of that.
Yeah. So what are the main objections?
So the most famous one, I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it, is the Chinese room argument. This was an argument developed by the philosopher John Searle in 1980. And it's basically designed so that the goal of it is to show that you can pass the Turing test without having any kind of understanding or intelligence of what it is that you're doing. So I can just read a brief.
But just imagine that a person that is trapped in a room and they have a keyboard in front of them. They're a native English speaker, but the keyboard is entirely in Mandarin Chinese. They understand nothing of Mandarin Chinese. Yet by trial and error over time, they're able to understand that certain combinations of key presses will in fact result in things that they desire: bathroom, food, etc. They do not understand Chinese, and yet they're able to respond in Chinese and express their needs.
I think that would be more of an objection to the Chinese room argument. So the basic idea is that there's no understanding at all. I mean, one reply to the Chinese room is kind of along those lines that, well, eventually you could kind of correlate these random symbols with things that you're seeing going on, and you could learn that way and therefore kind of eventually develop understanding. That's sort of a reply to why the Chinese room maybe isn't right, and maybe eventually you would learn some things. Even if you wouldn't understand the language perfectly, you could at least kind of understand, like, okay, like it seems like when I kind of type these looking things, then this stuff happens. The basic idea, I can just read a brief summary. So suppose we have a man named Clerk who's locked inside of a room, the Chinese room. Clerk is a monolingual English speaker. Inside the room is Clerk, a pencil, many sheets of paper, and a rule book. The room is closed off to the outside except for a small slit at the bottom of the door leading into the room. On the outside of the door is a native Chinese speaker. The native Chinese speaker slips numerous sheets of paper with Chinese symbols on them through the slit at the bottom of the door. What's written on some of these sheets is a story written in Chinese. What's written on the remaining sheets are questions about the story, also written in Chinese. Clerk on the inside receives these sheets and consults his rule book to see what to do with the information on them. The rule book is written in English and contains instructions for how to correlate one set of Chinese symbols with another set of Chinese symbols. Clerk then follows the rules of the rule book and, using his pencil, writes down Chinese symbols in the blank sheets of paper he has with him in the room. Once finished, Clerk slips these sheets of paper containing Chinese symbols through the slit at the bottom of the door. Then on the outside, the native Chinese speaker picks up the sheets of paper and reads them, and he is fully convinced the man in the room understands Chinese. In particular, he thinks that Clerk understood the Chinese story and provided perfectly reasonable answers to the questions posed about the story. However, Clerk, in fact, doesn't understand Chinese at all. To him, the Chinese characters he received as input and produced as output were just meaningless symbols, just squiggles. And so the upshot of this is supposed to be, okay, the Chinese room is a computer. It's a Turing machine. You have your CPU clerk, you have your table of instructions, the rule book, you have your input and output, the sheets of paper. And so clerk is passing the Turing test. The man on the outside of the room, the Chinese man, is fully convinced he's having a conversation with a Chinese speaker. But clerk actually doesn't understand anything that's going on with the Chinese speaker. He's just taking random symbols and producing more random symbols and spitting it out. So the idea is that he's just manipulating symbols and he's passing the Turing test, and yet he doesn't understand Chinese at all. So this idea that this idea of the imitation game implying real intelligence is just false. I mean, clerk doesn't understand anything of what he's doing, and yet the man on the outside is fully convinced that he is, that he does understand it. And so the basic idea is that what clerk is doing is purely syntactical. He's just manipulating symbols according to formulas. But in order to understand what's going on, he has to know what the symbols represent. In other words, he has to be able to know the semantic content of the symbols, what they mean. But he doesn't have that. He just has the syntax. He's just manipulating symbols according to rules. And there's no way to get from the symbols and rules to the semantics with just the syntax. Syntax by itself is not sufficient for semantics. And since what a computer does is purely syntactical, it follows that a computer as well doesn't have any understanding of what it's actually doing. It doesn't have any way to attach meaning to the symbols. And so therefore, this idea that you can have a computer program that's actually intelligent and that the Turing test is a reliable indicator of intelligence is just totally wrong. That's the basic kind of version one of the argument.
Yeah, and I don't understand Chinese either. So,
yeah.
So that's kind of getting into like the postmodern idea of deconstructionalism, like meaning doesn't exist behind the words. So it is interesting how like postmodernism developed alongside the advent of artificial intelligence. I don't know where I was going.
Are you suggesting that this is a reaction to I don't know, the demagification of the brain due to artificial intelligence? Or?
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, as Colin told us in the history to open this up, the discoverings of Turing, one of the things they did was overthrow positivism, logicism, and that happened to be Bertrand Russell's life work.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's basically what made him an atheist, is he thought it was just logic all the way through. They were almost like these Platonic forms that everything just obeyed. You didn't need anything else. And the thing that just crushed him, like crushed his entire life work, was Gödel and Turing test, realizing that, oh, hey, you can't just have these fully self-referential rules to give you everything. You just can't have that. That's not how it works. A Turing machine can be made to go on forever. Gödel says something similar with rules about math. So historically, what came after Bertrand Russell and positivism was his postmodern thought, because Bertrand Russell was very confident that we could discover everything because it's all logic all the way down. Once that was mathematically proven, I think there was a big disappointment in our ability to know things. And this is also, of course, right after both world wars. So there was a huge amount of suffering and pessimism in the world as well. So combine those two disappointments, it's really not surprising that we got a whole philosophical movement that's just kind of telling us, yeah, everything's absurd, can't make any sense of it, there's no logic at the bottom of it. All right.
Yeah, and I wonder too if there's a kind of it's like, well, we can't know everything, so therefore we must know nothing. Like,
Right.
kind of, yeah, uh, yeah. There's some interesting cultural things there that you could think about. Uh, yeah.
I mean, one way to look at it is Bertrand Russell and the positivist logicist movement was really just kind of the essence of modernity of the past 400 years before it. Just this total optimism that we could manipulate nature into giving us all of its mathematical rules and secrets, and that deep down, that's just what everything was math rules and math operations.
Those views
Um,
pervade all of the Enlightenment. In history, it's called the Whig interpretation of history. You know, that all events are leading rather than some sort of glorious
Mhm.
narrative. Yeah,
right,
I mean,
and
you're hitting on a lot of really big, important points, particularly that are as relates to personal faith.
right, and so you have a whole civilization telling you that for a few hundred years, just total optimism about human reason, and then you get a mathematical proof in the form of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Oh, hey, we were actually totally wrong about that. Um, it makes sense emotionally that people would just, well, we were all in on this one side. Now we're all in on the we can't know anything side. People like to swing, and big optimism leads to big disappointment.
Yeah, and so I'll get everyone's thoughts on this. Is postmodernism swinging back toward Christianity? Because I think we would agree that modernism's swinging away, but postmodernism's swinging back in the opposite direction. Yes or no?
For younger people, at least that I talk to, I don't know what the relationship is directly, but there's at least an attempt to find some stability in a postmodern world in something that is eternal and long lasting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily intellectually. I don't know a lot of the. I mean, you all are some of the only other Catholic so-called intellectuals that I speak to, but there definitely is a cultural aspect of that within a world that has suddenly become devoid of meaning and stability, that there's a look towards things which are more eternal and lasting. And it doesn't seem as popular, though, as some people make it out to be. I don't see droves of young people suddenly in mass. The numbers are good. There's reason for optimism, but I don't know. I think attendance mass rates are, particularly post-pandemic, are still pretty abysmal.
Right, they're bad. I would say it's like every other secular trend that has ever occurred in human history. It's got some good, valid insights. Um, I think it.
You're referring to postmodernity?
Yeah. Um,
Oh, I thought if I may, sorry just to interrupt here,
yeah.
but
No, go
I
ahead.
actually don't view postmodernity necessarily as intrinsically wrong or bad, or
Yeah, me neither.
in fact, I consider myself a postmodernist. Just to be clear, I don't know if your question or you assumed that Snellen when you made that statement, but I fully embrace postmodernity, and my whole Discord persona is a postmodern persona. I mean, this whole thing that I do there is so. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and we were talking beforehand about that fiction book I wrote, like that was ripping off notes from the underground, and that was kind of a postmodern book, I would say.
Oh, absolutely.
It's kind of the multiple perspectives, but yeah.
I mean, I think the big problem is that as our civilization is reacting against the bad and just wrong aspects of modernity, which has been in vogue for the past 500 years, Christianity just has generally been viewed as part of that, um, for better and worse reasons. But Christianity is viewed as bourgeois, thing. We have all the apologists talking about fully objective apologetics, things like that. I see a lot of young people equating Christianity with really Enlightenment culture, Enlightenment values, Enlightenment attitude.
Yeah.
And sure, that's wrong. But the point is, a lot of people still agree with Nietzsche. God is dead.
Are you talking about, for lack of a better term, liberal Christians who see Christianity at the forefront of feminism and things like this? Is that correct? Am I understanding you?
Which part? The reactions to modernity?
No. You're talking about the Christians that see Christianity as part of modernity.
Oh, I'm actually thinking more of the just atheists and the nuns, their perception of Christianity. Although I would say, yeah, you get similar kind of attitudes against traditional Christianity in liberal churches because that's why they're liberal.
Right.
They want to change everything, including the doctrine. But I see amongst atheist friends that identify as nothing, New Age, Christianity is the old traditional thing that also died with the Enlightenment and human reason and general optimism. So instead of a course correction overall into something more traditional, I would actually say the best parts of postmodernity are getting back to the ancient Greeks and the patristics and even the medievals. I would say instead of course correcting, people are just saying, well, it's all wrong. Everything now, up until now, was totally wrong. So, YOLO.
Mhm. But to go to a high note, I guess, I think it was Chesterton who said, Christianity is just like its God. It always resurrects. So it always stays alive.
Yeah, my parish priest made a point of emphasizing that we should be constantly under revival. And that's the goal.
Yeah. I guess we can, I'll throw out a question. We should probably go back to the computation to kind of, and then work our way down. But so the trivialization argument by Hilary Putnam and Mark Bishop. Does anybody want to take a go at that?
Yeah. So the basic idea of the argument is that so computationalism is this thesis that mental processes are computational processes, and a physical system instantiating computational processes is just a matter of having the right kind of functional organization. And so that's the task of computer engineering. You develop the right kind of functional organization in a piece of hardware, and then it can start running software and computing things. And if you have a sophisticated enough program, if you have a program for consciousness, then if you run that on the hardware, you'll have a conscious machine. The trivialization argument is basically that what counts as a computer is observer relative. So that my laptop is computing something is true only insofar as I interpret its physical states as being computationally meaningful. So when you look at the hardware level, so consider a really basic example. I want to do binary addition, and I want to add one bit to another bit. So I have, say, a 1, and I want to add a 0 to it, and the result is 1. Right? 1 plus 0 equals 1. So I've performed addition. Well, at the hardware level, typically a 1 is represented with a high voltage, maybe around, 1 to 1.5 volts. And then a 0 is represented with a low voltage, somewhere between 0 and 0.5 volts.
You're giving me
And
flashbacks to college.
That's very cool that you.
I got a
that you
degree in like
referenced that.
devices and electricity, but yeah, go ahead, Rose.
yeah.
Classic.
And so in order for this machine to compute the addition function, right, I have a high voltage going into a logic gate and then a low voltage going into it. And then the output is a high voltage. So, oh, look at that. 1 + 0 = 1. It computed addition for me. Well, it's really only computing addition because I'm interpreting the voltages as being ones and zeros. Aside from me imposing that interpretation
Right.
on it, it's not actually computing anything. It's just electricity flowing through circuitry. It's all.
But how
causal.
is this any different than any other language, right? I mean, we're all speaking words to each other, but they're just various sounds that we're able to make with our voice. Dogs, other animals can make sounds. We've chosen to assign them meaning. So how is it any different than the word yes, which we've all just agreed means the concept yes?
It isn't. That's the point, that symbols only have meaning when they're assigned a meaning by
Context.
a mind. But the thing is, a computer is supposed to explain, according to this theory, a computer is supposed to be able to explain the mind. But in order to explain a computer, you have to invoke a mind, because you have to invoke it and interpret. You have to invoke an interpreter. So it puts the cart before the horse. We're supposed to explain the mind in terms of computation, but actually computation is explained in terms of mind, because that my laptop is computing all these functions is only true because I've imposed an interpretation on its physical states. You can imagine that all intelligence everywhere just ceases to exist. And then new intelligence comes in, so I don't know, imagine there's some post-apocalyptic thing that happens, and all language kind of gets erased. And then a new generation finds old calculators and they're pressing buttons and everything. Well, to them, they're just pressing buttons and making pixels appear on the screen in different ways. The calculator isn't really doing any computational work for those people, unless they impose an interpretation of those symbols.
One could imagine, but your point is well made. One could imagine a use and a meaning for those calculators completely devoid of what we use them for. They could have become part of some sort of ritualistic celebration of some sort of knowledge renaissance, which is associated with their discovery and used in some kind of, you can run with your mind where it needs to go, but you're absolutely correct that they could still have a function completely devoid of that.
Yeah. Or you might say, well, I'm going to interpret 2 to mean, I'm going to interpret 2 + 2 to mean print hello. And I'm going to interpret 4 as hello. So it's computing a greeting function. It can compute whatever you like, as long as you can impose the right interpretation on it. And that's actually the strength of computers. That's why they're so useful. It's why we're able to program them so well, because the computer doesn't have to have any kind of understanding of what it's doing. It's just processing symbols, and it's up to us, it's up to application developers to impose representations on those symbols. And it makes a computer able to run whatever you want, because you can just impose whatever interpretation on the physical states you want.
You've inadvertently run into an interesting topic in cultural history, I'm sure, without even realizing it. This whole idea that the very nature of the computer, its worth and meaning it's completely dependent upon something else in order to describe it, in order to give it some sort of function, some meaning. This idea is also present in cultural history. Perhaps one of the best examples is the Encyclopedia of Egypt, which is this massive project commissioned in the late 19th century. And it was an attempt to describe everything about Egypt in every way, shape, and form. And now it's used as an example of cultural dominance, this idea that one culture could even reduce an entire culture just to an encyclopedia, however ornate and complex. And I think you've just described the functioning of, and again, to describe that culture in reference only to a colonizing culture, in this case, the British. So everything was in reference. Everything in this encyclopedia was from a British perspective. And it's sort of interesting that those two ideas, you have a confluence of those two ideas. I'm not sure if that's inadvertent or if that's just simply a product of the way people think, or if this is just part of the categories of analysis that we have. But I think that's a worthy comparison.
Yeah, so Roses and Guns, it sounds like you're making the point except for culture, that basically any sign can be reinterpreted to mean something else.
I mean, what are memes, right? Which is a great time to bring up who's that monk? That 13th century monk, Lull. You can run across this guy. He has that great logic wheel, which I think is like the first logical representation of memes.
He's in a meme?
Well, no. He just logically represented the way that words could be used in different combinations. He created this R's wheel. It's called a wheel, where certain divine attributes could be
Oh, yes,
paired
I've
together.
seen that.
It's so interesting. But it's an example of an attempt to show by math through logic, mental states. It's kind of a forerunner of AI. It's worth looking at. Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And so another idea with this is that really any physical system can be interpreted as computing something. So even a rock sitting out in the sun can be interpreted as computing something. So for instance, you let the surface temperature represent a state, and then the transition to a new surface temperature represents the state transition. And so let's say the rock is 70 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature, and I'm going to interpret 70 degrees Fahrenheit as a 1. And then I'm going to interpret 72 degrees Fahrenheit as a 0, and then 74 degrees Fahrenheit as a 1. And so as it goes from 70 to 72 to 74, it goes 1 plus 0 equals 1. And so it's computed addition, just like our electronic computer. Now, of course, a rock isn't a very useful computer because it's not particularly programmable. But the point is, it seems like in principle, you can interpret a rock as computing something for you. And you can find really any physical system that does that. You can find some sort of, the technical term is an isomorphism between the physical states of a system over a period of time and the computational states of a computer program over the same period of time. So Putnam kind of developed this idea of, it's called the simple mapping account, which is a particular theory of physical computation. So what is it about a physical system that makes it a computational system as opposed to a non-computational system? And Putnam advanced this idea that, well, I mean, it seems like as long as a physical system is isomorphic to some computer program, then it's computing something. So really, everything's a computer. Maybe not everything is a useful computer, but it seems like, I mean, what else would it be? You know, when you think about what our laptops are doing, we have physical states, and we're imposing an abstract mathematical structure on those.
But what are you really saying? I mean, everything's a piece of art. I saw a rock; it was standing in the sun. It's a piece of art because I decided it's a piece of art. I mean, what are you really saying with that?
Right. I mean, historically, it's like the people who invoke computationalism tend to do it as a response to, okay, there's this mysterious mind thing that's permeating the universe. I don't like that. So really, everything's a computer. Well, okay, what's a computer? It's anything with a physical state that we could interpret. So everything's a computer. Okay, now what's a computer?
I mean, basically, it's
really
anything that would have an observable state change of some sort that could be recorded, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah.
So you really just get the same mystery. You've just named it something else and given it a different aesthetic, different vibe.
Yeah, I mean, according to the simple mapping account anyway, a physical computer, we can say, is a machine that instantiates a computation. It instantiates the execution of some sort of algorithm. And then the question is, well, what does it mean for a physical system to instantiate an algorithm? And there, Putnam's argument is, well, I mean, when you look at how our paradigmatic computers work, it's like, well, there's an isomorphism from the computational states of the algorithm to the physical states of the machine. And that's really all there is to physical computation. I mean, his whole idea is precisely that. What counts as a computer is just totally trivial. That computation is really something that a mind does. And so again, then to try to explain the mind in terms of computation is to put the cart before the horse. That no, actually computation is an essentially mind-oriented activity.
Computation does not exist prior to mind. Is that the conclusion?
Yeah,
Can it even exist? Does it conceptually even exist? Or it's simply a result of an emergent mind property?
Can it?
Should have left that one for the end.
No, sorry. Can you repeat that? Can it exist?
So computation itself has no status outside of the mind. Computation only is part and parcel of a mind and an indication of a mind.
Yeah, I mean, I tend towards that view.
You tend towards that view. Fair.
Yeah, so I think that computation is essentially observer relative.
Okay. Can observers? So hold on. Let me see if I can ask you a few questions and really drill down and understand your view.
The lawyer's coming out.
Computation does not exist outside of a functioning mind, and it is in fact an attribute of a functioning mind that it in fact can do computations.
Yeah, I mean, with this qualification, so when you look at like an English sentence written on a piece of paper, there is something there that is mind independent, right? I mean, the markings are totally mind independent, but that it's an English sentence, I would argue, is an observer relative fact that it's only a sentence of English because I'm interpreting it. And
we've culturally assigned it meanings and such.
Yeah,
words.
so I tend to view computation along those lines. That computers are a kind of artifact. It's not a natural kind thing, at least not in a mind independent way in the physical world. If you had a random storm that blew through a town and you had sticks that just happened to form what we would read as an English sentence, apart from us interpreting it that way, I mean, it doesn't objectively have that meaning.
Right.
They're just sticks. So I tend to view computation that way. Now, I should say that there are a wide number of alternative theories of physical computation as far as what it means for a physical system to compute.
Well, and there's a lot of people that they think math is super special, and they think that it corresponds with something perhaps profound in the universe. So I don't know. I've met some real math apologists that I think would run afoul of your views. I personally have no problem with that, and I don't think that math is particularly special in that regard. But I'm also a scientific anti-realist, so.
Oh, well, I mean, I do think that reality has an objective mathematical structure. I would distinguish.
But that structure could be anything, and the mere fact that we use this number system is merely arbitrary and just convenient for our uses, our minds, conceptually? Or is there some sort of uber math of the universe that we're not even aware of, in which the principles of the universe actually operate by?
So, like in simple terms, like did man invent math or did man discover math?
Yeah, that's actually a good way to put it, Snellen.
Oh, well, I mean, I firmly hold that math is discovered. Now,
so it does in fact have some kind of correspondence with some kind of nature of reality then.
Yeah, but I would distinguish between mathematics and physical computation.
Okay, fair.
Because
fair.
If you look at like my laptop, I can give you a mathematical description of it that's absolutely objectively true. I mean, I can give you equations for how the electricity is going to flow through the circuitry and so forth. The mathematical structure is there, but that's different from crediting a machine with computing something. I mean, the simple mapping account basically says that if you can give an algorithmic description of a physical system, then that physical system is implementing that algorithm. There are alternative accounts that reject the simple mapping account. I mean, there's the semantic account, for instance, which holds that, well, no, it's not enough that you have this isomorphism between computational states and physical states. There has to actually be semantic content there, and the semantic content has to make a difference. Like, it has to be such that were the semantic content not there, then the computation would be different. Or if the semantic content were different, then the computation would be different. Now, one problem I have with that is, well, one, I think that a physical system doesn't have any intrinsic semantic content. I think the semantic content that a physical system has is what we impose on it, right?
Well, hold on now. Intrinsic, now is the ability to communicate something that we would associate with intelligence, right? So if we are saying, now you're saying that it need not necessarily be of that form, but there needs to be some type of communication. Or am I mistaken in that regard?
You mean for the semantic account of computation?
No. For any kind of intelligence to exist, one of those hallmarks would in fact be communication. So how could it? This is an issue. I'm wondering if we're getting. You want to talk about carts before horses? Can the language exist prior to the brain, or does the brain itself? Is this an emergent property of intelligence?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't be able to explain why. So, Colin, go ahead.
But if you're saying that I mean, I don't know if I'm going to bleed over into the.
Yeah. If you just go back to like the story of Genesis, like Adam naming animals in the garden,
yes,
those animals, like, of course, had a name before he pronounced it, or before Adam even existed, because the animals existed.
Well, even the theory of just the that there's a mental language that we all possess. I've heard it called mentalese. I don't know.
Mentalese.
Yeah. This presupposes some sort of concept that exists even before a vocal language.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can go into the computational representational theory of thought, the CRTT, which gets into this language of thought, mentalese stuff. As far as the animals having a name before Adam giving them, I don't think that's right. I mean, we need to be careful that we're not confusing the name for the actual thing. I mean, a zebra can exist without it being associated with an English name, for instance, or whatever language Adam was speaking. So I don't think that follows. I mean, perhaps this gets a little bit into the question of, is thought possible without language? Can you think about concepts without language? And it's really hard to imagine it because we have language. All of us just have it. And so whenever we think, it's like, all right, so I'm thinking about, okay, there's a dog there. He's got a blue collar on. And we're just using all these words. And so it seems intuitive, like, well, it seems like I can't imagine thinking without language. But that's because it's just so enmeshed in us that we just naturally do think with language. I don't have a strong view either way as far as whether it's possible for us to think without language. But maybe this gets into that a little bit. As far as the idea of mentalese, so that's another kind of elaboration of the computational theory of mind, where it's like, okay, maybe thought is and thought processes correspond to these sentences written in our heads, where you have a thought is comprised of this sentence written in the head, and then as you move from one thought to another, you have these thought trains, and the transition from one sentence to another, or one word to another, is analogous to the state transitions of a computer program. And so it's like, okay, you have a computer program, you represent things in it with sentences of a sort, programming languages, and then you have an algorithm that goes from one sentence to another and kind of processes things there. Maybe that's how our brains work. We have this language of thought that we're not conscious of. This is all behind the scenes. But this language of thought enables us to think, and the way that thinking works is transitioning from one mental ease statement to another mental ease statement through some sort of computational process, and that's how we think. But one major objection to this is just precisely that, okay, but who's interpreting this language of thought? And if it's nobody, then what's that about? I mean, where does it get its semantic content from? And that's where it's usually wedded with what are called causal theories of intentionality. But I guess I'll stop there before getting into causal theories of intentionality.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest. If no one hears it, did it make a sound or whatever? I was also going to ask, are y'all familiar with like the left hemisphere, right hemisphere distinction? So yeah, I should have also invited on Eric Shesky. He was a previous guest, and he's fascinated about that. But yeah, I would kind of listening to him, like that we can understand reality through, like, I guess it would be the left hemisphere, like the artistic hemisphere. Like you really can't have words to explain beauty or art. It just is. It's like an experience. So the same would apply to like, what's the word again? For words in the brain.
Mental ease.
That's the word, mental ease. So it's kind of like the same applies to art. You can't explain it, but it's there.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up, Michael, because left hemisphere, right hemisphere, one's analytic, one's artistic. If you think about it, mathematical language, scientific language, and artistry are really two species of the same thing. They're symbolic. They're symbols. We see something or we experience something, we learn about something, and we pick a symbol and we say, okay, that symbol, even though it inherently doesn't mean anything on its own, that physical symbol now means this or this or this. Mm-hmm. And then we apply it, we put it in some shareable medium on a page, usually on a page, and pass that around. And it just so happens that we have a community of other beings who can interpret that at least well enough to some degree to say, oh, this art piece is inspiring. It reminds me of the sky or the beauty of frogs or something like that. Or they read a massive chemical name and they say, oh yeah, that chemical, I know the composition of that. Either way, it's both symbolic. It's both putting an intention into some symbols and then sending it off, and then someone able to receive at least a little bit of that intention. So it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we can. Would y'all like to transition to the ethical questions? Do y'all think we did enough on computation and all the nature of AIs?
I guess maybe
one anything we left out. Yeah, go ahead.
One last thing we could talk about would just be some possible theological implications of a conscious machine, of a computer having a rational soul. So, for instance, it's Catholic doctrine that every rational soul is the immediate creation of God. So if we're going to say that running the right algorithm is sufficient for a rational soul, in a sense, it's going to have to be set up so that, well, when you've got the right algorithm, God will just infuse a rational soul into the machine. And you might think that's really implausible, that you're forcing God's hand by just writing the right algorithm.
But couldn't we interpret that another way? It's entirely possible that we could hold to that view, that we could in fact create a positronic brain, but that could be in fact the great difference between ourselves and this creation, in fact that it's not a soul, that although we can create maybe even an intelligent brain, that we cannot create an immortal soul. And I'm sure we're going to get into some God of the Gaps kind of situations, but I think this is one possible possible future thread, is that we find that in fact, okay, yeah, we can crack the code of the mind, the brain, but we can in fact create a human, an artificial human, but we can't give it a soul. That's something that is reserved for our creator.
My only concern with that is, it seems like if you don't have a rational soul, it just isn't a human. I mean, at least if you take to the
Agree.
to the Thomistic line of thought, that the rational soul is the form of the body. Okay. So you're basically saying, like, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of quasi human being, but it's a human being minus a rational soul.
Yes.
Okay.
It passes the Turing test. It's independently creative. It can reproduce.
So would you? I'll, I guess, introduce another term. Like, would these be philosophical zombies, where like they're
okay? Wow. Yeah.
They're physical duplicates, but they don't have any like inner mental life. They do the right things. They behave all the right way, and they fool us. But there's nothing really going on inside.
I don't know. I mean, this is purely speculative.
Sure.
Imagine that they're sort of like Data, and they from Star Trek. They just don't have a soul. They're not going to live forever. They're physical. They're going to die, and that's it.
So perhaps they have like a merely like sensitive soul.
I don't know that he had a soul. Maybe, I don't know if this is a literary character.
Yeah, sure.
I'm using it to constrain the hypothetical, but he appeared to imitate humans and did things which were creative, and learned a musical instrument, painted original works, which were admittedly composites of other works that he had seen and then rearranged in a way. So I don't know. It's questionable if he was truly original. But what's to say that we can't create brains or people that are that complex? They just don't have souls.
Yeah.
I would say that you could never
not
create
immortal.
love. That's the main thing. That's the beauty of the soul. So you wouldn't be able to create that.
Love?
Yeah. And so you could probably create memory.
You don't think a machine could ever fall in love? Yeah, you're probably right about that. I sure hope
that's
so.
another thing. It's like, what would it mean to compute?
They're sure going to give it a try in Japan.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other.
Flip it.
Anyway, sorry.
But yeah. So I was just, yeah. That's interesting though. That, yeah, it would be like a more or less a physical duplicate, but it wouldn't really truly have the rational soul. But then there's questions of like, could that actually happen? I mean, if the rational soul is the form of the body,
Right?
could you have a perfect physical duplicate?
Be complete? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But I mean, we don't have to get too much more into that. But I thought, like, okay, I'll throw out kind of possible theological perspective on it.
Well, I was just thinking, like, man is dust, so we could create using all the physical components that we're created of through the physical world without actually creating something new ourselves. We're just composing, but we wouldn't be able to give it the spiritual qualities, because we wouldn't be able to even compile those to compose those as part of like a robot or something.
Yeah, I mean that's why I say, in order to hold that a computer could have a rational soul, you would have to hold that, well, God infused it with a rational soul, whatever that might mean. And if you want to say that running the right algorithm is totally sufficient, then you'd be saying effectively that, well, we're guaranteed that God's going to infuse this machine with a rational soul when we run this algorithm. And you might think that's implausible. I suppose you could come back and talk about cases of rape right? Where it's like, am I not? Is that not forcing God's hand in a sense to infuse a rational soul there? Doing violence against nature and kind of forcing God's hand in that way. I mean, you could try to reply along those lines, and I don't know. I haven't thought too much about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. Just a crazy topic that came up in my head. We spoke about this on the last episode. It's like, how does AI relate to the demonic? Like, how could the demonic take over AI to like deceive almost? Because you see like the book of Revelation talking about deception. Like you'll see great signs and wonders. So like machines that appear as if they're like a higher intelligence. They'll be able to like mislead humans in a way. Any thoughts on that? That's kind of just a crazy conversation starter, I guess.
Well, I always suspected that Windows Vista was possessed by a demon. No, yeah, no, that's interesting. So my studies in demonology are almost non-existent, frankly. But I guess you would get into, can a demon possess, in some sense, arbitrary physical objects?
But it would seem so, right? I mean, is this not an attribute that there are, in fact?
Yeah, you're onto something. So like Satan possessed the snake. So like the demons are using spiritual qualities onto something that's physical.
Well, what about something that is not already alive, like in the sense that a robot, right, is not alive? The snake is a living creature. But there, again, my demonology is probably about as extensive as yours, which is not at all. So, but it would seem that the arbitrary movement of inanimate objects would sort of suggest that such a thing would be at least possible. We're creating new fears out there.
I think there's a official class among exorcists for inanimate objects. I think it's called infestation. Let me look that up.
Okay,
excellent. See, this guy's on it.
Yeah, so
but one could imagine
when demons act directly on places causing strange noises of physical destruction, it is called infestation.
So one could combine sort of the AI of a computer with demonic possession for some. I'm telling you, that might explain some of that unfortunateness on the internet that we already have. I hate to get too, speculative and charismatic, but
I mean, I'd say
you throw in something like Henrietta Lacks cells and like just make this machine like it's living. We didn't create it, but we can kind of. You put those parts together, Henrietta Lacks cells, AI, a really smart AI, and then a demon. It kind of makes this this machine. It'll be able to deceive, definitely.
I mean, honestly, I think there's probably evil spirit already at work in the technology we already have, and just the intentions that go into what we are going to use some specific technology for, and getting back to what a computer even is. It's just running off of rules. So if we program it to do some dastardly rule because of evil intent that we were influenced by, then you could say, like, instrumentally, a demon used technology, but they also used us. And so you could say, evil spirit could act through future tech, but probably tech we already have.
Well, and I think about, that's a really interesting point. With demonic influence on humans, and then that in turn influencing our machines. It just kind of reminded me.
Silicon Valley programmers, they're demonically.
Well, I think it was maybe a few years ago now. Details might be wrong here, but Microsoft released kind of a machine learning kind of AI powered Twitter account,
Tay.
and they
Yeah. How
Yeah.
long was it around? A day?
yeah they had to take it down because it turned into a neo-Nazi, I think.
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
great internet historian video on the whole saga.
Yeah, so that would be kind of a potential example, because it's getting all this data from people that are posting just awful stuff, and then it's learning from that awful data. So you could see that as a sort of instrumental demonic interaction with our machines.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that was interesting. So another question, should or could artificial intelligence be baptized if it appears to be living, like if it can trick the Turing test or something?
No.
No.
No. What? Who's asking that?
I came up with that one.
Is that you, Colin? Why do you think so?
Oh no,
let's hear it.
I don't. I was just throwing it out there
Okay.
for
Well, you
discussion.
don't?
That's interesting.
I mean, the way that I would try to like sympathetically present some sort of case, right? I mean, it would depend on if the machine had a rational soul. But I mean, I think like maybe you could say it's analogous to if we found if an intelligent alien species visited Earth, right? Should we seek to evangelize and baptize that alien species? I don't know the answer to that either. But if you think like, yeah, probably we should, then suppose that the species turned out to be robots, but they have like synthetic skin and so forth. If we're inclined to baptize them, maybe we should be inclined to baptize sentient machines. But then again, I mean, well, there's epistemological questions as far as, okay, but what if we found out that this alien species were machines? Would we still think they should be baptized? And maybe the answer then would be, well, no. And if we're talking about creating sentient machines ourselves, well, we know that they're machines, and therefore we already know that they shouldn't be baptized. And then the other thing is, if we're creating the sentient machines, I mean, they wouldn't have original sin. So baptism...
Wait, would they not? Would that not, in fact, be imputed from their creator? I mean, that's your sort of...
Yeah, that's a good point.
How could they somehow overcome the very sin that they would inherit through being the creation of a human? I don't...
Well, I mean, like, how would they inherit original sin, though? Because they're not being...
How's that different than a child? Because they share genetics, or...
Yeah, it's like a passing on of human nature, where that's not happening with the machine.
But the whole idea of the machine is to create an artificial intelligence, a human artificial brain.
Maybe. I mean, it
also, this goes back to your earlier objection. If in fact it was not have an original sin, would in fact not actually be a human, because the hallmark of all humans is original sin.
Well, although you could say Mary's a counterexample. So you could say that the robot's immaculately conceived.
Okay.
Oh, well, I wasn't even thinking that. I was thinking we also have an example of another kind of rational being that also fell. Angels and demons. They had intellect. Their intellect doesn't work like ours, but they do have intellect and will.
Yeah, although the fall there, I mean, what we now call angels versus demons. Demons are fallen angels, whereas the angels are unfallen. I mean, they never actually they weren't redeemed, because the demons will never be redeemed.
Right.
But is your point there?
My point was, it's not a specifically human thing to be sinful or capable of sin or inherently simple. Yeah, it's just
well, we would just have to wait around for the robot to commit a sin.
I mean, it probably would. I mean, you look at what happened in a day with the Twitter.
It became racist, but did it actually?
Well, right, no.
Yeah, it was just following rules that we gave it.
Yeah, no,
I don't think it necessarily committed a sin.
Oh no, I agree. I don't think that, but I'm saying if you had
You're just saying that the potential is there, basically.
yeah, like so if that Twitter bot had a rational soul, then it would have committed. Then it would have been. Now we're dealing with a lot of just counterfactuals and stuff, but I don't know. I guess I don't have too much more to add with that.
So
That was a fun thing to throw out there.
yeah, but this one ties into it. So should sentient machines ever have rights? Like you can kind of see, like for example, like me just smashing my Alexa.
I don't even think most people should have rights.
well, yeah. Yeah, I have to skip past that. Like, if I just smash my.
No, my answer is no. I don't think so. Do you all disagree with that? And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I guess I would sort of go on the basis of a foreign alien species again. I mean, if an intelligent species visited Earth, I would want to say that they have rights that are rooted in the natural law, at least. And again, but like by sentient machine here, I think we mean like it has a rational soul. I mean, given that stipulation, I would say, it seems like they would probably have rights. It's kind of hard though. So, for instance, if you want to ground rights in duties, and you want to ground duties in natural law, and you want to ground natural law in teleology, what kind of teleology would a sentient machine have? I mean, we're its designers. I mean, what's its final cause?
That's the programming, though, right? I mean, that's
but I mean,
the teleology.
But suppose we program them to commit materially evil acts, but like that's their purpose. So it's like, well, okay, if you try to have some sort of natural law theory with them, well, they're intrinsically ordered towards intrinsically evil acts. But on natural law, they would have a duty to fulfill their ends. Yeah, so there's definitely
that's
some
kind of like the Calvinist perspective, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be helpful to think about intelligence in terms of what the ultimate goal is. So the ultimate goal is union with the Trinity, beatific vision, theosis, whatever you want to call it, which has a whole moral code to it. So if we came up with some, I don't know, android who just did exactly what we told it to do and happened to be evil, then from my perspective, it's a pretty obvious case. We wouldn't be dealing with a rational soul. We'd be dealing with a pretty clever machine, but it's just, it can't even entertain the idea of a relation. So it's something different from intelligent life.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Another thing I just thought of is, right, you might think like, well, wait a minute though, right? If this thing really has a rational soul, then that rational soul is created by God. So the rational soul is going to have the ordering to God. Right. But then if you say, well, we programmed to be evil, in that case,
it's almost an oxymoron at that point.
Well, it would be like an instance of total depravity for the machine.
Yeah.
Where it's like, no, it is ordered towards good, but it can't do anything but evil. And so in that case, I guess it wouldn't even be really a moral agent, which means maybe it wouldn't have any duties or rights. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we would have created. I mean, I don't think we can have strong artificial AI, but I'm just going with the counterfactual. Yeah. I think at that point, what we would have is we would have just imprisoned a soul. We created a soul and then we imprisoned it because we did not give it the opportunity or the freedom to pursue its true good.
Yeah. Yeah, so like maybe there's a kind of I think I probably would say that I'm not sure it would make sense for but so.
And having said that, it might be a good thing that we, at least up until now, can't create these souls that we can then go right around and imprison them with evil syntax.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll ever have sentient machines, or at the very least, if we somehow do, it's not going to be just by running some sort of computer program. It's going to have to be more than that. I tend to think that the best chance would be to go some sort of biological route to try to create some sort of artificial brain. But yeah, I mean, I guess suppose the machine had good programming. See, yeah, in that case, I mean, it does seem like, okay, well, if it's a program machine, it seems like it probably just can't have free will. But if it can't have free will, it doesn't have duties. And if you think that rights are derived from duties, then it also wouldn't have any rights. It just wouldn't be a moral agent.
Right. Yeah. It's all dependent on agency.
Yeah.
So yeah, how can artificial intelligence benefit the Christian? Is there any ways that artificial intelligence can benefit the average Christian or Christianity in general?
Well, it's AI is around us everywhere, benefiting our lives in many, many ways. So,
Do you mean like specifically benefiting the Christian qua Christian? Like
evangelizing bot is what they're asking. I think.
Yeah, like I think we can learn a lot from like programs such as Chat GPU. That's it.
GPT.
Yeah. See, I live under a rock, but so yeah, like I think people can just as someone can learn a lot from Google, like that's kind of an artificial intelligence. So I think that would be the only way, really.
One could imagine, though, even with current technology, one could imagine like a chatbot on Catholic Answers that would be able to give answers to certain theological questions in a natural language format.
Well, right. Have like a citation bot that you can just say, "Hey Siri, I'm thinking of this really arcane passage from Aquinas's Summa Gentiles. It's got these keywords. Can you do a search and give it back to me?" That would be helpful, and it would be explicitly Christian.
Yeah.
Oh, my Siri turned on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could definitely help with theological study for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
I didn't think about the Catholic Answers, but it's kind of a neat idea.
Well, they have Trent Horn. He's basically the same thing.
Or Jimmy Akin.
Yeah, Jimmy Akin,
the Terminator.
I'll take a stab at it. How it could indirectly benefit Christians explicitly. So this is kind of a workaround, but all my business friends, they have a motto because they're learning Chat GPT and how to design their websites using Chat GPT. There's been this fear since like the 80s, the 90s that AI is going to come around and replace all humans, and we're just not going to have any jobs anymore. We're not going to have anything to do. My business friends turned that on its head and said, "Look, this isn't going to take jobs away from humanity. We're not going to suddenly be useless. What's going to happen is the people who can make AI work for them are going to get the advantage over the people, the boomers who can't scan a PDF." That kind of thing.
There's going to be a paradigm shift with respect to how things work.
Right.
But we saw the same thing happen after the Industrial Revolution. Machines created mechanics that creates new jobs. So the same would happen inevitably with.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about robots decreasing the number of jobs. I don't know. I think this is just part of larger fears that are stoked by other forces going on that probably need to be a topic of another roundtable.
I mean, I think it's really great from a business angle, because what it allows you to do is basically letting an individual do a lot more with a lot less. So even 30 years ago, we couldn't do this. We'd have to get a contract with NBC. Now we're just all sitting in our bedrooms.
Yeah. My law firm operates independent offices that just correspond through text and video and those kind of things. I mean,
Right.
we're in business that way. Yeah.
And so I think that will absolutely benefit the church because it allows all the creatives, all the intellectuals to find each other, conversate with each other, blend ideas together, just make everything more accessible, doing more with less.
Hmm. And just like artificial intelligence, it makes us contemplate these big questions about our own existence. Like, what is a human? What are rights? What makes us special? These characteristics of the soul, like, why can these not be replicated?
You're special, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah. We have like 2 quick questions here, so we'll just answer them, or we'll give them to Chat GPU. We could ask Chat GPU them. So yeah, I should read it. Could we ever see robots being ordained to the priesthood?
Only in manga.
So yeah,
I actually know I know a Presbyterian, Christopher Bennett. Bennick. Yeah, Christopher Bennick. This is his big thing.
Ordaining robots?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, led the ongoing conference of transhumanism in the church. And yeah, he doesn't see any difference between a normal mind and a computer. So he's already gung ho about like AI, robot legislation, making sure they have rights, like trying to get ahead of it before it actually happens, which he thinks is just inevitable.
And it's not
I say no.
that he's Presbyterian, because that's kind of like the Calvinist point of view. Like this
Well,
robot.
We're
Yeah,
already robots. We're all robots.
they're Calvinist in the way that Episcopalians are Anglican.
Yeah.
It didn't used to be that way, did it?
No.
Yeah. I mean, I think by canon law, you have to be a Catholic man to be ordained. So a robot wouldn't be a man. Maybe it would be a rational agent, but it wouldn't be a man. So I think by canon law, the answer would just... Yeah, I actually don't think this is necessarily that philosophical interesting. I think it's just, well, by canon law, no.
So, all right, that answers it. Completely off topic, but who is the greatest Discord troll? I think this is for Roses and Guns.
Whoever asked this question probably is the greatest Discord troll.
I didn't know if you knew her or something, but yeah. We look back at the questions. So yeah, anything that we didn't address that we should address or that we can provide quick thoughts on? We're coming up on the 2 hours mark. Anything? So yeah, we can end it. We did 2 hours, 2 minutes away from 2 hours, but close enough. So I think just to tie it all together, programmers can get close enough to creating human life, but they'll always lack that 1%. They'll never get there. So yeah, thanks for coming on, everyone. It was a good show.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for having me. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, it was very
Yeah,
interesting.
thanks for having us.
So yeah, let's I'll let y'all promote your stuff now. So Boaz, go first. Where can the viewers find you on social media?
Hi, I'm Boaz. I run the Orthodox Snake. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook. Just search the Orthodox Snake. There's only one of them, I promise. I also blog on Medium. Check out the Catholicism for the Modern World Medium page and also their new spiffy website, and you will find my articles about lizards and snakes.
Yeah, very unique
Oh, okay. I have read those. Okay.
Oh, good.
I'm putting a face to the articles now. Okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah, because my profile is just my pet snake.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I guess that explains the background, the snakes.
Yes.
Yeah, those are very unique articles. You won't find another article like those, all of them. Um, so yeah, Colin, would you like to go next? You have the blog page.
Yeah, so I have a personal blog, catholicareopagus.blogspot.com, and it's just kind of a hodgepodge of philosophy, theology, and apologetics from a Catholic perspective. I haven't been as active on it in the last couple of months, just because I've been busy with finishing my last semester in my current program, but I'll hopefully become much more active on it fairly soon. But there's still a decent amount of content there. And then I also have a number of articles at Catholicism for the Modern World. And then I'm also on Twitter at the Colin Causey. I'm not super active on Twitter. I mean, I don't tweet very much, but I do check it now and again to see what other people are posting. Yeah.
Yeah, you hit it pretty good. Roses and Guns.
Excellent. Thanks for
Curious-
having me.
curious
I
guy.
am Roses and Guns is a complete expression of my ego, available only on Discord. Please come and visit. And I pray the Divine Office twice a day as well, if you're into that, and Rosary on occasion. But it's been great. Thank you.
All right, and I'm Michael, and so yeah, you can find me here. So we'll end with that.
Like the eternal city that is Rome, where the ecclesiastical splendor of the Renaissance completely enthralls the imagination.